You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. In the previous episode, we started talking all about the concept of holistic sexuality, which is a process of self-discovery that helps us to really understand who we are as sexual beings. Holistic sexuality is about having a deep understanding of and appreciation for our own bodies. It's also about knowing what it is that brings you pleasure, knowing how your own libido works, knowing what it is that you need and want in a partner, and possessing sexual agency. Put another way, holistic sexuality involves having a deep enough level of self-understanding that you can make choices that are aligned with your core needs and feel empowered to live out those choices in your own life. In today's show, we're going to dive into a couple of key aspects of holistic sexuality, including pleasure and desire. We're going to talk about how we can have a healthier relationship with both pleasure and desire, because these are things that many of us feel a lot of shame about. A lot of people feel shame or guilt about what it is that brings them pleasure, or they feel ashamed because they think their sexual desire is either too high or too low. So we'll talk about how to drop the shame and lead a more pleasure-filled life. We're also going to discuss some tips for sexual communication around our wants and desires, because this is something that so many people struggle with. I am joined once again by Dr. Juliana Hauser, a licensed marriage and family therapist and licensed professional counselor who specializes in relationships, sex, and sexuality. In addition to running a successful virtual private practice, Dr. Juliana is a nationally known expert in this area whose work has appeared all over in the media. She is also author of the newly released book, A New Position on Sex, a guide to greater sexual confidence, pleasure, and authenticity. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Are you looking for a space that celebrates diverse perspectives, explores new frontiers, and brings all of your favorite people together? The annual Sexological Conference, hosted by Sexual Health Alliance, is where sexuality leaders gather. This conference connects you with world-class experts, leading sexuality companies, and a community of like-minded, passionate, and welcoming professionals. You'll find your people at the Sexual Health Alliance Annual Sexological Conference this October. Get your ticket to be inspired, educated, and empowered. Note that this conference is open to anyone and everyone. Head over to sexualhealthalliance.com, select the Annual Sexological Conference page, and save your spot today. Join leading researchers and experts for insightful presentations and discussions on the evolving landscape of sex and aging at the Kinsey Institute 2025 Specialty Intensive and Symposium this fall. This event will take place on October 4th, 2025, with both online and in-person attendance options available. To learn more, visit kinseyinstitute.org. And to stay up to date on the latest events and educational opportunities, follow @Kinsey Institute on the socials. Okay, Juliana, in the last episode, we started talking about the concept of holistic sexuality and the pillars that support it. So let's dive further into it. One of them that you discuss in the book is pleasure. And it's really a shame that pleasure isn't included in much of the sex education that people receive, because we often get cultural messages around pleasure that aren't helpful and in fact can be harmful. So we learn, for example, that pleasure is selfish and entitled, that there's something shameful in the pursuit of pleasure. We also learn that pleasure isn't something that we should prioritize. We should put it on the back burner and reserve it only for special occasions. And I think that leads us to have this kind of unhealthy relationship with pleasure, because we spend so much of each day denying ourselves pleasure that when we have the opportunity to actually experience it, sometimes we then go overboard with it because we're trying to cram as much pleasure in a really short period of time. So I wanted to ask for your take on this in terms of, how we can have a healthier relationship with pleasure and lead a more pleasure-filled life.
What a beautiful introduction to the concept of pleasure, too. Thank you. Pleasure is a really pivotal, all the pillars are pivotal, which is why they're included in it. But pleasure, there's so many topics within it. And it could be its own book. And it is for a lot of people, because self-pleasure is an aspect of it. But in the book, I step back and say, we just need to talk about pleasure in general. Let's talk about the culture of pleasure. And you described it really perfectly, which is we do a lot of denying and we do a lot of self-denial. We deny other people. there's still so much. If you hear someone doing something that it brings them pleasure outside of a sexual context, there'll be an internal reaction of like, wow, selfish, like, oh, you went to Copenhagen for a month. Wow, like, must be nice. And even if that's not said, there's often this reaction of like, wow, you have audacity to think you get to have something that brings you happiness or pleasure. And I think it's subtle in a lot of ways. We don't even realize it. I think it can happen very, very quickly. To me, the way to combat that is we have to have subtlety in how we embrace it as well. I really like, and in the book, I talk about doing micro pleasures and infusing that. And I also took it a step further and I start using it. So I don't ask people if it was a good time, was it fun? I will say, did it bring you pleasure? And, my friends now, like, no, like, oh, Jillian is, doing it again. But when I was kind of relentless in that and said, hey, like, I'm struggling with trying to find pleasure in my life. And I'm hearing myself sound like such a jerk about my days. Like, oh, it's like, so another busy day. And it's almost like that's what's acceptable, is to sound miserable or to be miserable.
Yep.
And it's not acceptable to be like, I just had the best sex last night. I just had the most incredible meal. And I tell the story in the book about this time I was in Napa Valley and I was by myself and I was at this winery and I had this incredible cab and this wonderful raspberry sorbet that didn't seem to go together, but it's what I ended up with at the end of the night. And I remember thinking like, oh my God, I love this. Like, this, so good. And I made the decision to start talking about it. I was alone in a booth. I'll honestly never forget it. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to talk about it to the world, just say it out loud. Like, this is the best. And I turned around, I was like, this is the best ever. I'm sure I sounded drunk or weird or whatever. And I wasn't either of that. I wasn't. But I remember thinking, why would I feel okay laughing and having people hear me laughing because someone told me a funny joke? But it feels weird to put out in the world that I'm finding pleasure in what I'm eating and drinking, let alone inside of a sexual context or, sexual act. So I started saying to people, just help me infuse pleasure into my verbiage, into the way that I'm speaking about things. And it changed. It did work. Talking about it differently and putting it into my vernacular made a difference of me thinking and prioritizing pleasure, me stopping making it be something that I had to sanction on weekends or vacations or whatever. And I'm not saying that, at a bus stop, I'm telling people about the great sex I had, but I have learned that celebrating my pleasure in whatever context is something that I want to have in my relationships. And I want to be around people who feel comfortable in their pleasure also, because we have a synergy of pleasure, and science backs how important pleasure is to our bodies and to our mental health. Why wouldn't we infuse that more? And so I love having pleasure buddies.
And, I think normalizing talking about pleasure is something that is really important. But, you're so right. And I hadn't really thought about this before, is that like almost every conversation that we have with other people is about the negative. It's about, things that are going wrong. Thinking, for example, about when you're talking to your aging parents, the first thing that's going to come up is what's this new health issue that they're experiencing. And, when you're talking with your friends or your coworkers, it always comes back to how work is so stressful right now, or the, state of political chaos in the world. And, when you're talking with your partner, even if it's about your sex life, instead of focusing on like the positives and what you're enjoying about it, we tend to focus on the negative and, what we don't like about it. And we tend to be hypercritical. And so we're just not talking about pleasure at all in any of these contexts.
No. The example I gave when I said earlier about that, we shared Copenhagen at different times this summer. Mm-hmm. I realized, again, I'm talking about this all the time. I've literally written a book that is talking about this. And I heard myself when I was telling this story to people when they asked how our summer was. I started off every single time until I became aware of it, of the story of losing my passports 3 days before we left on our trip, which is true. And it was awful. And that felt like the acceptable entry point into saying, and I had the best month of my life with my daughter. It was Copenhagen for us was truly one of the most transformative countries we've been in, and the ease and the swimming. And I would hear myself once I started going on the list. I even feel it now. I mean, I know we've got a time constraint, but I even feel like, whoa, it sounds so self-indulgent to have given myself that. So I need to dampen it by telling you all the negative things or the hard parts of it so that I don't have a discomfort with what I think you may have a discomfort or jealousy or whatever that is. When actually what it could be is I could be setting an example of like, do you know how great it felt? I had the worst week before we went on this trip. And let me tell you, it is worse than you think to lose your passports. It is horrific. Don't ever, ever do it. But I could be saying, you know how great it is to have budgeted, to have figured out how to have an apartment there, to have slowed down my work for that month. And it certainly came at a cost, but why don't I think it's a beautiful example instead of a threat to somebody?
Yeah.
And I think that's also within who we are as sexual beings too. We hardly talk about sex as we should. It's more sanctioned to talk about the negative part of what we experience sexually or that, which is, it's important to share our trauma points and the awful things, but we don't have a lot of room to talk about the good parts. If you think about it, who's in your life, who do you know how they like to self-pleasure? Like, people don't give details of what they're doing that feels good. We certainly don't do that with our fantasies either. I loved a work that you did on fantasies. And one of my favorite exercises that I did when I was teaching at William and Mary was I had my students write a fantasy. And I said to them, it was based off of a SAR, like the sexual adjustment, which I still don't like that word that we have to do in our training, what they say. But it came from an exercise that I had in there that I had people write a full out fantasy. And I said to them, go for it. Like, write a fantasy that is so big that you'd be afraid for other people to read. And they did it. And it was one of the few things that I had them print out and bring to class. And I had them put it on their lap. And I would walk around the circle. We always sat in a circle. And at this point in the semester, they had to build a lot of trust with me. And so they did trust me. And I would pick a student that I knew I had a rapport with, and I would say, can I hold your fantasy? And they would be like, oh, I mean, yes, but okay. And then they'd hand it to me like, I trust you. Like, right, I can trust you. I was like, yeah, I'm not going to read it. I said, do I have permission to turn it over? And I'm not going to put my eyes down. And they're like, oh, like, I trust you, but like, oh, I don't know. And we go through different exercises with it. And really what, kind of came down to was shame over what brought them pleasure and fear that what brought them pleasure or arousal was going to be something that said something about them that scared them of what people would think. And sometimes it was the scariest thing was to realize what actually brought them pleasure and to own that they had interest in being pleasure filled. And it was just a very powerful lesson that I'm sure in your work, you know what I'm saying, you've experienced with your own work too.
Yeah, totally. I mean, some of us are scared of our own pleasure in various ways and feel a lot of shame about what it is that brings us pleasure. And I think, all of this speaks to the point of, we've got a lot of baggage attached to pleasure. We have a lot of things that are kind of built into our culture that lead us to deprioritize pleasure. And we need to change that. Like, I think we would all be a lot happier and healthier, not just in the bedroom, if we learned to prioritize pleasure and to make pleasure something that we do every day, even if it's just a small act of pleasure. Anyway, we could probably talk about pleasure for hours. But,
we could.
But let's move on and talk about desire, because that's another one of these pillars of holistic sexuality. And desire is something else that a lot of people have a complicated relationship with. I would venture to guess that the vast majority of people either think that their level of desire is too high or too low. Very few people probably think, I have just the right amount of desire. And I think that's because we're often taught that desire is this bipolar thing, that it's either high or it's low. There's no middle ground. And I think that leads a lot of people to feel shame around their desire. So talk to us a little bit about that and why we need to think differently about desire and take a more expansive view of it, just like we do with pleasure.
Yes. So when I look at the pillars of holistic sexuality, the 9 pillars, I have a mini visual also of the relationship between desire and pleasure. And if I was to do a metaphor of like a bonfire for what our sexuality is, I would put pleasure and desire together, like in the kindling. That is, it's like the embers of who we are as sexual beings that need to be tended to, and they have a relationship with each other. And they're both highly connected with embodiment. So our ability to put into our body our feelings and our awareness and our thoughts, and have all of that be a beautiful information source that allows us to make different decisions with our life. It is like, well, no one's talking about that in sex ed for sure. And certainly, like if pleasure isn't a part of it, desire is definitely not included in even some of the most advanced sex education programs that are out there. They're not speaking about even what desire is. And I use the word desire over libido. I've just seen people have a different reaction to libido than desire, but we were talking about, the same thing, just different packaging of it. And you are absolutely correct that of all the areas of sexuality that we're looking at, desire is really like the cornerstone of right and wrong. And I'm not even sure how that happened, because there's other places where it could rest a little bit more easily. But somehow the sexual culture has decided that desire has a continuum, and it's a bit very small, which is the correct place, which is not right. And what I ask for people to look at when they're looking at their own desire is, I want you to look at it as a relationship, not as a destination. And it's a relationship that's going to be fluid. It's a relationship that's informing and is informed. And when you can stay present-minded in yourself. And I was somebody that came into this work, I don't know how you were, Justin, but I didn't have a very big mind-body connection. I was so in my head, and I was feelings and I was thoughts. And that was just my natural way of being in the world, that when I learned about embodiment, I was like, oh no, like this is like, I didn't know meditation. I didn't even know when someone would say, like, what does your body say? Is it a yes or a no? It's like, it's saying nothing. I don't know. Like, my thoughts are saying something, but I had such a hard time understanding what my yums and yucks were. And that was in particular with thinking of what desire. And I, for a while, really wrestled with what's the difference of arousal and desire, pleasure and desire. And when my fear and discomfort of not understanding what this was, because I think that's ultimately what was happening to me, was like, oh no, if I don't know what my body is telling me that I desire, or where desire, falls in this, then I'm not going to get to this destination that this teacher sounds and looks like they're having great sex and they're like the perfect sexual being. And I'm sitting here in my button down shirt and like, I don't know. When I could get out of that and be like, okay, I'm going to trust this guidance, my body did start talking to me, and I did start learning a relationship with it. And I use that as an example of building into who I was as somebody who had desire in my life. And again, that's, more of a mind-body experience. Then we have to add on all of the sexual messaging that we are given about what it means to be someone who, again, has the audacity of wanting pleasure, who wants to have sex acts with themselves or with other people, and all the words that are attached to that. We have to sift through all that too. And then we have to learn the science of it, of our hormones and how our anatomy all fits together and truly is conspiring to bring us pleasure and desire. And if it's not all happening together and our relationship with desire isn't what we want it to be, then we have to grieve and acknowledge that there's earnestness in that grieving that is valid. And as we move through the grief of that, to say, well, hello to desire on my terms. And I had this course called The Wanting that was solely directed towards desire. And I would have in it a letter that was like, dear desire, hello. And another one that was like, dear desire, fuck off. And it was such a beautiful way to make our desire be something that is both outside of who we are and this objective thing that we get to work with, and then put it inside of ourselves and let it be complicated. I think the complication of desire is what feels overwhelming to a lot of people.
Are you tired of navigating the confusing and, let's be honest, sketchy world of libido supplements? You're not alone. There are tons of libido products on the market that make big promises, but finding one that actually lives up to the hype is a tall order. because many of the options out there contain questionable ingredients, or they're underdosed or ineffective. But what if there was a libido booster you could actually trust? Let me introduce you to Drive Boost from VB Health. Drive Boost is different. VB Health is built on trust and transparency. Their formula isn't a mystery. It's doctor-formulated, third-party tested for purity and potency, and proudly made here in the USA. And here's something else that makes Drive Boost unique. It's designed for both men and women. So if you're ready to ditch the shady stuff and choose a libido supplement that's effective and that you can feel confident about, it's time to check out Drive Boost. Learn more and get yours at vb.health. Visit vb.health and use code Justin for 10% off, or click the link in the show notes. You know, what you were saying about kind of like being in your head, I think that's something that a lot of people experience. And it's part of what is a block in terms of us being able to feel desire and also to experience pleasure. You know, I'm one of those people where my mind is always going. You know, there's an internal monologue that doesn't shut off. And, you know, I've come to see and I think really understand myself in terms of why I'm always in my head, which is because I have this sensory hypersensitivity when it comes to sounds. And so I'm often like retreating into my head because it's like a safe space where I can kind of block out the auditory input that is unpleasant to me. And so I'm one of those people who is like constantly startled because, you know, I'm so stuck in my head that, you know, if you just say something randomly out of the blue, you know, my partner does this all the time. Like I have an intense startle reflex, like multiple times a day, every day, because I'm like so stuck in my head. But, you know, when you're in your head like that, it can be hard to feel desire and also to know what it is that even brings you pleasure. Because I think if you're somebody who's kind of always in your head in everyday life, you're often very much in your head during intimate and sexual encounters. And so you're not very in touch or in tune with your body. And you don't really know what it is that you want or enjoy or even what it is that brings you pleasure. And so I think that's where there can be a lot of value in mindfulness-based practices and other techniques that try and help you get out of your head and into the moment. Because I think so many of us are just used to spending our lives just kind of constantly being in our heads.
Beautifully stated. Exactly. And for me, my safe place were my thoughts. And it was a place where I, you know, had some sense of control and it was familiar to me. And one practice that made a big difference that again, doesn't necessarily seem like it would be such a direct correlation to who I am as a sexual being. And meditation made an enormous difference in my life, but it was also pretty difficult for me to do it, was I started cold plunging. And it's for me, I just do 4 minutes of it. But if you're doing the water in a cold enough state, you can't have thoughts with it. And I remember the first time that I was like, ooh, I am absent of thoughts right now. I am surviving. I'm fighting for my life here for these first 30 seconds in it. And it honestly felt like a relief. And the stillness and the quietness for the first time didn't feel uncomfortable. And that helped me really grow in this place of like, I don't have to just have safety in thoughts because I'm never going to be somebody who doesn't have that. Just similar to what you're saying, I have a different reasoning, but it's just going to be naturally who I am. So the goal shouldn't be for me to not be in my head at all. But I wanted to know what it was like to not be there at a constant place and to know I had some options to not be there. And again, I think this may not be what everyone has as their thing, but you'll have something like that. And there'll be something that's hindering your connection, your relationship with desire or pleasure, that it's worth pursuing. And if you are curious enough, you'll be able to find a solution, if not many solutions, if you want to have just even a smallest of shift with your relationship with desire or pleasure.
So true. Now, another important aspect of holistic sexuality is being able to identify and understand what you really do and don't want when it comes to sex. But a lot of people don't have a very clear idea about this because it's not something they've ever really thought about in detail. And that's why I like the 4-quadrant exercise that you talk about in your book, which you frequently give to your clients. So can you walk us through this exercise and explain how it can be a valuable way to kind of get a deeper understanding of your sexuality?
I will. And I want to say first that it's not mine. I don't even know where this began. Do you know where this exercise began? I don't know. It's just in the ethers. It's just sexual educating like folklore at this point. But one of the reasons why it has stood the test of time is because it is so valuable and there are so many insights that can come from it. But the basics of it is that you have 4 different quadrants. One is sex acts that you have done before that you think you want to do again. Next is sex acts that you have done that you think you're done with and that you don't want to do again. Third is sex acts that you haven't done that you're interested in, that you think maybe a yes. And sex acts that you haven't done that feel like, yep, that is going to stay in the no. And then you have a long list of sex acts. And I provide a list there and on my website, but you can Google it also. There's lots of lists out there. But what I ask of those lists, if you don't do the ones provided, is they start from something that would be like kissing on the hand to something that you have to look up because you have no idea what they're talking about. Like it should be a range of things that are different between a nudge and a shove. And when you look at the list, you take every single one of them and you have the discipline to say, I don't get an out of this. I have to decide, where does this land in these 4 options? And I will tell people there is no 5th quadrant. It is 4. It ends at 4. And do not maybe your way out of this or contextualize your way out of it. I get it. There are a lot of things that do. That's the second part that after you do the exercise. But at the first part you do it, I want it to be a very activating part of your agency. I wanted you to check in with your body. I want you to be able to, is this a yes or is this a no? Where does this fit into things? And it's written in sand, not written in cement. It's just for who you are at this moment. And I've done the exercise enough with myself and I've done it with people multiple times so that I know it can shift how you're feeling about yourself, what your experience has been, where you are on your timeline changes what is a yes and a no for you, which is a great news. But for this exercise, you got to do it. It's a yes or a no in this. And even that act, having to own a yes or a no to something. Yes, I have done this. And no, I have not done that. It can be incredibly confronting. But you do it. And if I'm not alongside of you, I will metaphorically hold your hand as you go through it. Then you sit back and you look at your 4 quadrants. And it's really interesting how you assess your 4 quadrants. There's a lot of self-judgment that often happens. Like, wow, I've had people like, that is a full quadrant. I did not know that about myself. Or I don't want anyone to see all these things that I've done. Or I've had people be like, I've done quite a bit. Like, yay for me. Like I kind of forgot about that. Or they are sad that a quadrant is empty. And I'm not even saying which one of those 4, and you can put onto your own thoughts what you think that may be full or not. But it's an assessment of your comfort level with agency, which is like learning your yeses and nos and then learning how to live them. And then from a bigger picture, you can also look at this 4 quadrant exercise and think, so this is where I'm going to start saying no, because the truth of it is, I don't really like this sex act. And that's where I let context be added to this of like, it's a no in this circumstance or with this person, or this could become a yes if I had this as a part of things. I did this one time in a workshop. Someone raised their hand and said, I'm not partnered. And a lot of these sex acts are partnered. And I purposely make the list not to be that it has to be with somebody else, because so much of our sexual conversation is always positioned within a relationship or with other people. But she's like, I want to try some of these things. Like, what do I do if I don't have a partner? And we ended up working together, and we wrote this description of how she was going to go about asking somebody to help her with some of these things on the list. And because she's like, I want to know. My active agency is I don't know, not because I don't have an opinion, but because I haven't tried them. And I want to try them and I want to put them on my list. It felt so beautiful to watch this person claim that they didn't have to be withheld from who they were as a sexual being just because they weren't in a relationship or didn't have someone at their disposal. And she was so thrilled with a part of her that had solo activity, that for the first time she was like, yes, I'm a sexual being because I'm breathing. I don't have to have it with somebody else. And some of these sex acts weren't even necessarily traditional sex acts. They were just part of being a sexual being. And it was just so beautiful to see her open up to the possibility of who she was as a sexual being, just because I had a list of sex acts that she had to put into 4 quadrants. It was tangible, but it was also very mighty.
Yeah, it's amazing how such a simple exercise can have such a profound impact on someone, which I think speaks to and goes back to the fact that so many of us haven't really thought about or analyzed or really connected to our underlying sexuality and our wants and desires and needs and what it is that brings us pleasure. But, if we want to have sexual agency and be able to communicate our yeses and nos, we have to know what our yeses and nos are, right? And that's where the value of doing this kind of work comes in. But, speaking of saying no, no is one of the hardest words to say in the bedroom. And it's also one of the hardest words to hear in the bedroom too, right? It can be hard to say no to a partner because we don't want to make them feel bad, but then we end up doing something that we don't want to do. And, that's not really good for anyone. But by the same token, when we hear a partner say no to something that we've requested or would like to do or try, it can feel a lot like rejection, and that can trigger conflict. So, as a therapist, I wanted to ask if you had any advice on how we can get better at both saying no and hearing no in the bedroom.
Justin, I love your setup for the questions. They are all so good. Thank you for wording it that way and really doing the contextual work behind why we would be talking about this. I just greatly appreciate it, because I do think sometimes that these topics, it feels like a hurdle to even get to what the question is. And so it's like you're an expert or something, Justin.
It's not my first podcast.
Yes. So one of the things that I do, even like in just working with a client, and so I'm going to use that as an example, and then how I teach them to do it outside of a therapeutic experience is I celebrate no's and I celebrate I don't knows very strongly. And I will say, I cannot trust your yeses until I can hear your no's. And then I'll tell them I am a safe person that you can say no to. So I want you to practice that with me. And I am a safe person to say no to. That doesn't make it easy sometimes. Like there's a couple of times that I've been out with clients, and I'm like, be careful what you ask for, Juliet. You're getting a lot of no's right now. And I own that. Like, even if a no may not feel good, it doesn't mean that it's unsafe for us to experience that. And so I guess what I'm trying to explain is I'm not asking for people to be like, yeah, no, thank you for saying no to me every single time. And that's the only feeling that you have when someone says no to you. I do want you to feel good about someone saying no to you. That is an important aspect. But I also want there to be room for like, and also, okay, I'm grieving because maybe I'm not going to have that sex act, and, we're committed to each other. So if I'm committed to you and you're a no, I may not ever have this, like, darn. Or like, ouch, I feel judged, or, whatever the other feelings are besides that enthusiastic yes, like, thank you for owning your truth to you. So I invite complexity into the no reaction, but I really mean it strongly that I don't think that you can be somebody in sexual agency until you know how to be somebody who can receive no's, not just give them. It's kind of like the difference between boundaries with other people and boundaries with yourself. You have to be able to have your no and know what your no's are, but you have to be able to handle and receive other people's no's. And it's a skill we're not given in almost any context. And boy, do we see that when people get a no and they become a viral video. In most contexts in sexuality, those moments are not going viral. And so we're not giving modeling, nor are we seeing the ramifications of when someone is negative about a no. But we all have them. Mm-hmm. Every single one of us has experienced some kind of no. And I can go back in my history and think, ooh, I did not handle that very well. And I wish I could do a redo on that. And I have not given a no in a good way, and I have not received a no in a good way, which is, humbling. And part of the experience of growing in agency is owning that. So the phrasing that I used, and it does sound quite therapeutic. So I say, this is the phrase, use the right words for you and your relationships, is I can't trust your yeses until I can hear your no. So I need both. And when done well in the subdom world, like, when someone's negotiating in any kind of kink scene or whatever we're speaking about, the pre-conversation is often, again, the caveat, not everyone does it right, but for those who do it well, in general, in that space, it is all about that. Like it is, I want to hear your yeses. I need to hear your no's. And a lot of people who are experienced in the sub-dom world, they won't progress if a sub is all yes, 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 because they can't trust it in a lot of ways, or they have learned somebody says yes because they're people pleasing, not yes because they've done the work to know truthfully what is a yes and a no for them. Ultimately, that's what I'm trying to encourage people to do is it feels great when something's in flow and it feels wonderful when, everything feels like a yummy yes between people. But it really, you should build a muscle of, and it feels really, thank you for giving me a no. Thank you for knowing where my edge is. Thank you for letting me know where my guardrails are. And instead of seeing it as a huge loss on the other side of that guardrail of no, it's like, oh, great. Now I get to really lock in on the yes. And again, I know it's more complex than that, but that's the basic feel.
Yeah, it's a complicated subject, but it's something that we all do need to learn to get better at because, you're so right that we don't really see a lot of great models for this in terms of not just how to communicate and know, but also how to respond to it in a healthy, productive way without taking it necessarily as this form of rejection and letting it spiral into a massive conflict and argument. But thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Juliana. I really appreciate having you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work? And get a copy of your new book?
Yes, and thank you for having me. And I love being a repeat with you too. It's wonderful to see you here. So I'm Dr. Juliana Hauser on all social media platforms. And my website is Dr.-Juliana. And on the website, we have a page that has all the links that you can choose where to buy your books online. So I'm only selling the books on online platforms, and Amazon and Barnes & Nobles are some of the bigger ones, but there's lots of options. I'm really excited to interact with people and to answer questions. And one of the things that I did to put my action behind that belief is that at the end of each chapter that has the 9 pillars, I have a QR code in it. And the QR code takes you to a place on the website that really goes into depth on each of the 9 pillars, but it also is giving stories from people. And because even though I'm sharing my stories and I have client stories that have given me permission to share, it's so important for me to have lots of diversity and for this to be an inclusive space. And I'm just one person. And so, I've only done what my life is, and I do not position myself as like the way to do sex. And so I'd love for people to tell their stories through this QR code and to read other people's stories so that we really can give lots of modeling for people as to, how does sensuality show up in their life? One of them is called connection. Like, what does connection mean to you? I would love for this to become a source of modeling if we can't even have it in our own life. And I went off of your question, sorry. But you can, I want you to buy the book, but I also want you more to put into your life and to add to the conversation. It's not just to receive. I'd love for you to add.
And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. So thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here. Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.